Hello, and thank you to SACOSS for inviting me to be part of this celebration. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person today, but I'm really happy to be at least available to you in this medium. I'm Lange Powell. Most of you probably won't remember me or not have met me. I was the executive officer, as we were then known, of SACOSS from 1979 to 1985. And I've been asked to read you a piece of doggerel verse, let's give it a name. It's something that I wrote for my farewell dinner when I left SACOSS in 1985. And I feel a bit diffident about doing that because of course it's dated hugely. It does, however, for all its literary demerits, and there are many of those, it does capture something of the sort of naivety of the time and the much simpler environment that SACOSS was operating in back in the 1980s. I should perhaps give you a bit of a historical context for some of this, because there are no doubt some of you in the audience who won't remember what I'm going to be talking about. This was written in 1985, so in the early years of the Hawke-Keating government, the very successful Hawke-Keating government, which sort of turned sour in the way that political arrangements do. John Howard was at that time the leader of the opposition. And they all operated out of Old Parliament House. Some of you will remember, and some of you may have been there, the old whitewashed Parliament House that was still operating at the time. The new Parliament House wasn't open until 1988. States were, some of them anyway, still in the hands of Conservative premiers, most famously, I suppose, Johannes Bjelke-Petersen, who would still be a bit of a legend in Conservative political circles in Australia. There was also Robin Gray in Tasmania, also a bit of a Conservative warhorse. In our state, in South Australia, John Bannon was the Premier, still on the crest of his wave in some ways, because it was several years yet before the state bank collapse that brought his downfall. And he was involved in, well, obviously all sorts of state interest things, but interestingly, in 2017 he was negotiating for constructions of the first Australian-built submarines at that time. Adelaide still was host to the Grand Prix before it lost it to Melbourne, and the state was about to have its jubilee also in 1985, its sesquicentenary. SACOSS at that time was a much simpler organisation. It was chaired by the late Judith Roberts, sadly missed since she passed away in 2015. She was one of those heroes of human services really across Australia, not just in South Australia. She was deeply respected and sometimes loved by many people in human services, and certainly by people across the political spectrum, both national and at a state level. The council operated with an executive committee. It didn't have the same complex arrangements of a board and policy council with sectoral memberships that it does now. It was an executive committee which essentially played both roles. And we operated out of some offices in what used to be the headquarters of the Royal Antediluvian Order of Buffaloes, the RAOB, on Morford Street. They've now been, well, for many years they've been converted to apartments, but in the time that we were there, it was still leasing office space to us, and I can only, particularly after seeing the new renovated SACOSS premises in Marjorie Black House, I can only say that the conditions that we lived in were squalid, let's give it a name. They were particularly cold and dirty and rather smelly. So SACOSS moved, I think, then to Victoria Square, to some other buildings a few years later, not before time. So to talk about just this piece of work, it's called a SACOSS Fantasy. And please bear with me. It is, as I say, it is a very dated piece, and it makes deep acknowledges to Banjo Paterson, on whose work it's based. There was movement all through welfare, for the word had got around that the feds had cut the pension rate by half, and that other budget measures just too frightful to recount, would leave the poor with precious little cause to laugh. And right around the country fear and consternation spread. In Joe and Robin Gray near flipped their lids when they realised they might have to subsidise the daily bread of hordes of pensioners and their hordes of hungry kids. So the sick, the aged, the invalid and others to a man came to SACOSS in their hour of dire distress. I tried to write to a person, but I'm afraid it just won't scan, leaves rhyme and rhythm in the most unholy mess. In the cold and gathering gloom of the Buffalo's boardroom, SACOSS leaders plotted out their next campaign. We'll mobilise the caring world to fight the Treasury gnomes and bring pensions near to the poverty line again. So the first place that they went was the Tower on Victoria Square, where the Premier sits and plans the next Grand Prix. But he said, "I'm sorry, Judith, and it's not that I don't care, but there's a state election coming on, you see, and I've got submarines to worry about, and next year's Jubilee, and the opinion polls are looking mighty queer. Besides, the poor have had a terrific run of circuses from me. The bread will have to wait until next year." So they went to the opposition next and urged the Libs to take a solid stand against this miserable budget. But though they didn't quite say that the poor should just eat cake, they certainly did their level best to fudge it. "When we get back in government, the economy will grow. We'll have a state of which we'll all be proud. Besides, they're a federal issue, or really, all these pensioners, you know. Can we arrange a meeting for you with John Howard?" So the executive sat down again and had another hunch, that the press might want a new campaign to wage. But when they went to the advertiser, the chief of staff was out to lunch with little sign of editorial outrage. "Can you find us someone poor to interview?" the journalist said. "A pensioner eating dog food for her tea. Or some children cold and shivering under newspapers in bed. They'll make fantastic visuals on page 3. But slowly, very slowly, the voluntary sector joined the fight. And SACOSS angry calls were amplified by scores of self-help groups, all throwing in their widow's mite to stem this hideous budgetary tide. And SACOSS led this vigorous throng, and off to Canberra they went. You could hear the pollies quaking miles away, because they realised pretty quickly that the pensioners' intent was to get a better deal that very day. The Treasury benches emptied as they marched across the lake. The opposition hung its head in sorry shame, and SACOSS knew that it had scored a win to see the government shake, and that budget nights would never be the same. The PM met them in King's Hall with a kindly, tear-filled gaze and said, "Thanks to SACOSS, we have seen the light. Just tell us, now that you have shown us all the error of our ways, how to go about relieving poverty's plight." And the executive's reply, rehearsed in detail over years, during many a long and agonising meeting, confirmed each and every one of Labour's economic fears and produced an apoplectic Mr. Keating. "You've let us down," said SACOSS, "and with your latest budget cuts, you plan to slash the pension rate by half. If you want us to believe that you have really got some guts, only doubling pensions payments will be enough." Well, the government took heed. People's pensions multiplied. The voluntary sector hardly knew what hit it. And back to Adelaide, SACOSS came with a warm feeling inside. It had fired the bullet, and the unwilling feds had bit it. And down in leafy Canberra, where the gum-clad ridges rise above the cramped and whitewashed Parliament of Australia, the Treasury gnomes still wonder and are speechless with surprise that their budget could have turned out such a failure. And as they take their knives to defence spending and the like, fights with SACOSS are a prospect viewed with dread. The greatest fear they have is seeing welfare on its bike, while pigs fly in formation overhead.